Trump and Putin risk being the real losers of the conflict in Iran. While the former wanted to subdue the Tehran regime, the latter hoped to profit from the rise in oil prices and to use that money against Ukraine. The problem, however, is that now the opposite might happen, and Iran could come out of this crisis with a better result than the Americans. And this is a problem for both Trump and Putin. But the most absurd thing is that the results that Trump will achieve, if the agreement is really signed, probably could have been reached even without wars. And at the same time, what should have helped Putin's coffers now risks emptying them. I've noticed that many of you watch my videos and I'm really happy about that, but you're not subscribed. So if you enjoy my content, please subscribe. It's free for you, but it's vital for the project. Thank you very much. The agreement between the United States and Iran is not yet the final peace treaty, but a preliminary agreement that should be signed in Switzerland on Friday, June 19th. It will start another 60 days of negotiations on the real points to be agreed upon, especially the Iranian nuclear issue and the American sanctions. So for now, the main point is to stop the war and reopen the Strait of Hormuz, a strait where before the conflict about 20% of the world's oil and liquefied natural gas passed through. Blocking it means causing oil and gas prices to skyrocket, and this on one hand causes inflation. If gas and oil prices rise, utility bills, gasoline, and diesel costs increase too. However, sellers of oil and gas benefit, earning more when prices go up. And the one who has these raw materials is, for example, Russia itself, so closing the Strait of Hormuz makes Europeans poorer and makes Putin richer. But be careful, because even Americans are not immune to inflation. In fact, inflation that's a bit too high could hurt Trump in the American midterm elections that will be held in November. That's why for Trump it's important to reopen the strait. And in fact, once the memorandum is signed, Hormuz should reopen, and at the same time the United States should also start to remove their naval blockade. But against Iran, there's more to it than that. In fact, according to an American official, after the signing, Iran will be able to resume selling oil and fuel despite the sanctions. And that's it. These exemptions would also apply to banks, transportation, and insurance. It means that Iran would not only have permission to sell, but also to use the tools to actually do it. And keep in mind that Iran already has more than 100 million barrels of oil in storage and on ships already ready to be sold. And of these, more than 60 million would be outside the American blockade. Then, as if that weren't enough for Iran, an Iranian source, quoted by Reuters, also mentioned $25 billion in frozen assets that the United States would have agreed to release. But it should also be said that more recent rumors don't mention these specific $25 billion, and moreover, the American version is more cautious because Trump said that Iran will not be given cash. And Vance explained that no funds will be transferred just in exchange for signing the memorandum, but that the benefits will only come if Tehran takes concrete steps to set aside its nuclear ambitions. And be careful, the agreement would also include a $300 billion fund to stimulate investments in Iran, of which over $150 billion could even be committed right away. Of course, we're not talking about American public money or war reparations. However, if the agreement holds, Iran will get three things that just a few months ago it could only have dreamed of: fewer sanctions on oil, unfrozen funds, and possible foreign investments that the Iranian economy desperately needs. Of course, many banks and international investors might still stay away from Iran for fear of new policy changes. However, for Tehran, all of this is essentially a victory. And the Ayatollah's regime will come out stronger and can now continue to oppress any dissent without limits. In fact, before the conflict, the Ayatollah's regime had already been going through months serious on the domestic front because the economy was in deep crisis and there were protests that were very difficult to contain. The American goal was not just to strike Iran externally, but also to topple or weaken its regime. Sadly, the opposite is happening, largely because it is an authoritarian regime. To claim victory, sometimes it's enough just to stay standing and be able to tell your people they hit us, but they didn't break us. And if after the war you can also go back to selling oil, negotiate on sanctions, and maybe attract new investments, then the game is won. And now the Iranian regime can tell the story just like that. The Iranian foreign minister has already declared on TV that Iran won the conflict with the United States. What does this mean for Trump? Trump, in turn, tries to sell the deal as his own victory. But in reality, all of this is very complicated for the American president. He has always portrayed himself as a strong president who won't be deceived by Tehran. So much so that in 2018 he even dismantled Obama's nuclear deal with Iran, reinstating sanctions because he considered the agreement too weak and too favorable to the Iranians. The problem is that Trump now risks facing a situation much like the one he dismantled, Iran limiting or stopping its nuclear program. Even though we still have to see whether that will really be the case once the deal is signed in exchange for economic relief. However, keep in mind, Trump hasn't exactly lost on a military level, and the United States is without a doubt much stronger and better armed than Iran. Furthermore, Trump can say that military pressure brought Tehran to the negotiating table. But if after months of war, the final agreement isn't better than Obama's, then what was the point of tearing up the first deal and causing a war where many people lost their lives and the global economy was thrown into crisis? Probably no sense at all, especially since with Obama's deal, Iran accepted real limits for 15 years. It could only enrich uranium up to 3.67%, which is far below what's needed to make atomic weapons. Then Tehran could only keep 300 kg of enriched uranium and had to cut the number of centrifuges for enriching uranium from 19,000 to 6,100. In fact, according to the White House at the time, thanks to this agreement, Tehran had sent 25,000 pounds of enriched uranium out of the country and had removed 2/3 of its centrifuges. And so the time needed to be able to build atomic weapons went from 2 or 3 months to at least a year. Of course, Obama's agreement didn't completely solve the missile problem and didn't eliminate Iran's regional influence, but it was a good starting point to work from. But instead, Trump destroyed that framework in 2018. If Trump returns to an agreement that's not clearly tougher than Obama's, it seems he created conflict only to end up with the same deal reached years earlier without conflict. In Washington, the issue is already sensitive. Several Republican and Democratic senators have already asked for more details about the agreement, expressed skepticism, and requested guarantees on the control of Iran's nuclear program. This matters because Trump now faces double internal pressure. Democrats can accuse him of starting a pointless war just to revisit negotiations they already held years ago, while some Republicans might accuse him of having conceded too much to a regime he himself had promised to bring to its knees. However, this situation could also harm Putin. Why did the war in Iran cause oil prices to rise? And high oil prices are good news for the Kremlin, since oil and gas make up almost a quarter of Russia's state revenue. So, when a crisis breaks out in the Middle East and Hormuz is at risk, Russia breathes a sigh of relief because it earns more and has more room to finance the state. And has more room to finance the war in Ukraine, whereas when oil prices drop, Moscow suffers. And in fact think that thanks to this crisis, Russian revenues from taxes and oil and gas proceeds would have risen to about 650 billion rubles. That is, about 7 billion euros in May 2026 compared to 512.7 billion rubles, which is about 6 billion euros in the same month of 2025, while in the previous months revenues were decreasing. So is the Iranian crisis helping Russia? Of course, it's not enough to solve all the structural problems of the Russian budget. Previously, this was helpful, but now the agreement between the United States and Iran could have the opposite effect. Because if Hormuz reopens, the market will price in less risk and more supply because the oil and gas passing through Hormuz will return to the market, and in fact, already after the news about the agreement. Oil has dropped by about 5% for the second consecutive day, reaching its lowest point in 3 months. With Brent at $78.96 per barrel and American oil at $76.05 per barrel. And here you can see why Putin was interested in chaos, because a war in the Middle East, with Hormuz blocked and high energy prices, could have helped Moscow. While a peace deal that reopens the market to previously blocked Iranian supply, which was previously blocked, could become a kind of further sanction against Moscow. Then it's true that the rise in oil prices caused by the war in Iran still wasn't enough to balance the Russian budget. Because the price of Brent did go up after the attacks against Iran, even reaching over $110 per barrel, but Russian oil is still being sold at a discount. And just think that in February, the average discount compared to Brent, which is European oil, was $26.50 per barrel, and on top of that, there's also the European cap on the price of Russian oil. Basically, Europe, in order to penalize Russia, has set a limit. Russian oil transported with Western services cannot be sold above $44.10 per barrel, with the goal of making Russia earn less. And in fact, the price of Russian oil, which on March 2nd had reached 3,582 rubles per barrel, that is about $38.9, should have increased by more than 50%. To reach the levels expected by the Russian budget. Because the Russian budget for 2026 assumed oil at 5,440 rubles per barrel, that is $59 more. Between January and March 2026, Russia recorded a budget deficit of 4.58 trillion rubles, which is about $49.7 billion, equal to 1.9% of the Russian GDP. But Iran is allied with Russia, so it could take advantage of fewer sanctions to help Moscow sell its oil, right? Potentially yes, also because obviously the agreement doesn't turn Iran into a pro-American country and doesn't erase its relations with Moscow. However, the real question we need to ask ourselves is another one, that is whether Iran can sell its own oil. Why should it help Russia and risk new sanctions? In fact, helping Moscow too much could expose Tehran to new tensions, right when it is trying to convince banks and international investors to invest in the country. And Tehran's primary interest will be to finance its own economy and strengthen the regime, not to save Russia. Moreover, if Iran remains isolated and sanctioned, it does need Moscow. But if on the other hand, it can go back to selling oil to the world, it gains resources and room to maneuver. maneuver, and so Putin becomes much less necessary. Not to mention the fact that Iranian oil on the market could reduce the price of oil thanks to the increase in supply. And this could put even more pressure on the Russian budget. Anyway, as things stand now, it seems to me that the real winner is the Ayatollah regime. And while on one hand I'm glad if Putin will be penalized by the situation, on the other hand, I can't help but think about how the Iranian regime treats its own civilians when they protest. And until a few months ago, that regime seemed like it was about to collapse, but today it seems stronger than ever. Of course, the agreement might not hold, and we'll see if it gets signed. Israel isn't part of the mechanism and wants to keep its freedom of action, while the US Congress wants more details. And the issue of the nuclear program remains huge, since it will be necessary to understand who will verify and what will happen to the enriched uranium already in Iran's possession. In addition, the $300 billion fund depends on a final agreement from private investors, and banks could remain cautious for some time before investing. Also out of fear of possible changes in political direction and new sanctions on Iran that could put their investments at risk. So we are not looking at a definitive victory for Iran, but a huge potential victory. And in your opinion, is Iran the real winner of this conflict? Let me know in the comments, leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you enjoy my content. Bye.